The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Naval Training Facility's mess hall, casting harsh shadows across the rows of metal tables. Sarah Martinez sat alone at the far corner table, methodically eating her chicken and rice while reading a worn paperback novel. At 28, she possessed an understated presence that most people overlooked. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and her compact frame of 5'6" didn't immediately command attention. She preferred it that way. Sarah had arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Command training facility 3 days earlier as part of a specialized cross-training program. Officially, she was listed as a Petty Officer First Class from the intelligence specialist community, temporarily assigned to observe advanced tactical training methods. The recruits and most of the staff assumed she was just another analyst getting a first-hand look at SEAL operations for some desk job back in Washington. She had learned long ago that assumptions could be powerful tools. People saw what they expected to see, and in the male-dominated world of military special operations, they rarely expected to see someone like her. Sarah had spent the last 8 years cultivating that anonymity, using it as both shield and weapon in equal measure. The mess hall gradually filled with the evening crowd. Groups of SEAL candidates filtered in after their grueling day of training, their faces showing the exhaustion that came with pushing human limits. These men had survived months of the most demanding military training in the world, but they still had weeks ahead before earning their trident pins. The pressure was constant, and it showed in their movements, their conversations, and the way they carried themselves. At a table near the center of the room, 15 recruits from Class 247 settled in with their trays. They were a tight group, forged together by shared suffering and the unique bond that forms when people endure extreme hardship together. Their ages ranged from 22 to 31, coming from various military backgrounds and civilian careers. Some had been college athletes, others former Marines or Army Rangers. All had volunteered for the most challenging training the Navy offered. Tommy Richardson, a 24-year-old from Texas who had been a college football player before enlisting, was the unofficial leader of their group. Standing 6'3" with the build of a linebacker, he possessed natural charisma that drew others to follow his lead. Next to him sat Marcus Chen, a former Army Ranger with a quick wit and an analytical mind that served him well in tactical situations. David Murphy, the oldest at 31, brought experience from his previous career as a police detective in Chicago. The conversation at their table started innocuously enough, focused on the day's training exercises and upcoming challenges. They discussed the obstacle course times, debated techniques for underwater knot tying, and shared strategies for the next phase of their program. The camaraderie was evident in their easy banter and shared experiences. "Did you see the new analyst they brought in?" asked Jake Wilson, a 26-year-old from California who had previously worked as a firefighter. "Been sitting over there by herself every meal." "Martinez, I think her name is," replied Chen, glancing discreetly toward Sarah's corner table. "Heard she's here to observe training methods, probably writing some report for headquarters." Richardson leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Another desk jockey trying to understand what we do without getting their hands dirty. They send these people to watch us sweat and bleed, then they go back to their air-conditioned offices to write policies about stuff they've never actually done." The comment drew chuckles from several members of their group. The sentiment was common among operational personnel, who often felt misunderstood by support staff and headquarters personnel. The divide between those who served in direct action roles and those in support positions was a frequent source of tension in military culture. Sarah continued reading her book, seemingly oblivious to the conversation happening across the room. Her posture remained relaxed, her attention focused on the pages in front of her. Years of operating in hostile environments had taught her to monitor her surroundings while appearing completely unaware. She tracked every conversation, every movement, every shift in the room's energy without lifting her eyes from the text. The comments from Richardson's table gradually became more pointed. What started as general frustration with bureaucracy evolved into specific criticisms of outsiders observing their training. The recruits had been under intense scrutiny for months, evaluated and judged constantly by instructors and administrators. The presence of yet another observer felt like additional pressure they didn't need. "I bet she's never even been in a combat zone," Murphy added, his Chicago accent evident in his words. "Probably joined the Navy to get college money and ended up pushing papers. Now she gets to come watch real warriors train and pretend she understands what it takes." The group's energy shifted as fatigue and stress found an outlet in their growing resentment. Training had been particularly brutal that week, with 3 candidates dropping out and several others receiving warnings about their performance. The pressure to prove themselves worthy of the SEAL community created an environment where any perceived judgment from outsiders felt like a personal attack. Wilson stood up from his seat, ostensibly to refill his water glass, but his path took him past Sarah's table. As he walked by, he made a show of looking at her book, then returned to his group with a smirk. "Romance novel," he announced to his teammates. "She's sitting in our mess hall reading about love stories while we're training to protect the country." The comment drew more laughter, but the tone had an edge that hadn't been there before. Richardson stood up next, his considerable frame making his movement impossible to ignore. "You know what bothers me most about people like that," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "They get to observe our world without earning the right to be in it. They see our training, our methods, our brotherhood, and then they go write reports about how we could do things better. But they've never been tested. They've never proven they belong here." Sarah slowly closed her book and placed it on the table beside her tray. Her movements were deliberate and calm, showing no signs of irritation or concern. She had faced much worse than verbal harassment from insecure military personnel, but she recognized the dynamic developing in the room. These young men were looking for a way to assert their superiority, to reinforce their identity as warriors in the face of constant evaluation and pressure. The rest of the mess hall had gone quiet, sensing the tension building between the SEAL candidates and the lone woman in the corner. Other personnel continued eating, but conversations dropped to whispers as people became aware of the brewing confrontation. Richardson walked over to the serving area, ostensibly to get dessert, but his route took him directly past Sarah's table. As he walked by, he paused and looked down at her. "Evening, ma'am," he said with exaggerated politeness. "Hope you're enjoying your stay at our training facility. Getting lots of good material for your report?" Sarah looked up for the first time, meeting his gaze with calm brown eyes that showed no intimidation or anger. Her voice was steady and professional when she replied. "Good evening, Recruit Richardson. I hope your training is going well." The fact that she knew his name caught him off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered. His teammates were watching from their table, and backing down now would cost him face in front of the group. "Oh, you know my name. I guess you've been doing your homework on us, taking notes on our performance, our techniques, our weaknesses?" "I observe what I'm authorized to observe," Sarah replied evenly. "My presence here was approved through proper channels, and I conduct myself according to the standards expected of naval personnel." Her response was perfectly professional, but Richardson interpreted her calm demeanor as dismissive. In his mind, someone who had never proven themselves in combat had no right to be so confident in their presence. His teammates watched from their table, their expectation clear in their expressions. "That's great that you follow the rules, ma'am. But rules are different from reality. Rules don't prepare you for what we face out there. Rules don't tell you how to react when people are shooting at you or when your teammate is bleeding out next to you." Sarah remained seated, her posture unchanged. "You're absolutely right, Recruit Richardson. Rules and reality are very different things. Experience teaches lessons that no manual can convey." The response seemed to encourage Richardson rather than diffuse the situation. He stepped closer to her table, his height advantage now more pronounced as she remained seated. Experience. That's exactly what I'm talking about. See, those of us earning our place here have been tested in ways most people can't imagine. We've proven we can handle pressure, pain, fear. We've shown we belong in this brotherhood. His voice carried across the quiet mess hall, reaching every person in the room. The other SEAL candidates at his table nodded in agreement, their solidarity with their teammate evident. Several stood up and began walking over, not in an overtly threatening manner, but with the clear intention of supporting Richardson in whatever was developing. "And what exactly," Richardson continued, his voice gaining confidence as his teammates approached, "qualifies you to observe our training? What have you done to earn the right to watch warriors prepare for combat? Have you ever been shot at? Have you ever had to carry a wounded teammate to safety? Have you ever been in a situation where people depended on you to keep them alive?" Sarah slowly stood up from her seat, her movement fluid and controlled. Even standing, she was noticeably shorter than Richardson, but something in her bearing changed as she rose. The casual observer might have noticed a subtle shift in her posture, a slight change in the way she held her shoulders. But most in the room were focused on the size difference between the two personnel. "Those are fair questions, Recruit Richardson," she said quietly. "Perhaps we should discuss this outside where we won't disturb others trying to eat their meals." Richardson laughed, the sound carrying a harsh edge. "Oh, now you want to take this outside? What are you going to do? Write me up for asking legitimate questions about your qualifications?" By now, all 15 members of his training class had gathered around the table, creating a semicircle that effectively trapped Sarah in the corner. They weren't overtly aggressive, but their body language made it clear that this had become a group confrontation rather than an individual interaction. Chen, the former Army Ranger, stepped forward slightly. "We're not trying to cause trouble, ma'am. We just think it's fair to question whether someone who's never been tested should be evaluating those of us who have proven ourselves." "Tested how?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm despite being surrounded by 15 men who each outweighed her by at least 50 pounds. Murphy, the former police detective, recognized an opportunity to de-escalate, but also felt obligated to support his teammates. "Ma'am, with respect, we've all been through combat deployments, specialized training, selection processes that eliminated 90% of the people who started. We've earned our place here through blood, sweat, and sacrifice." "And what makes you think I haven't?" Sarah asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment, creating the first real pause in the confrontation. Richardson recovered first, his frustration evident in his voice. "Because if you had, you'd be wearing a uniform that shows it. You'd have rank that reflects it. You'd be training with us instead of watching from the sidelines taking notes." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. Around them, the mess hall had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to watch the confrontation unfold. The tension in the room was palpable, like the moment before a storm breaks. "So you believe," Sarah said carefully, "that someone's worth is measured by what they display on their uniform?" "I believe," Richardson replied, his voice rising slightly, "that respect is earned through action, not through some desk job assignment that gives you the right to judge better people than yourself." The insult was clear and direct, crossing the line from questioning credentials to personal attack. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her stance. Those with experience in combat zones might have recognized the almost imperceptible adjustment in her positioning, the way her weight distributed slightly differently, the manner in which her hands relaxed at her sides. Wilson, emboldened by Richardson's directness, stepped closer. "The truth is, ma'am, you don't belong here. This isn't some corporate office or government building where everyone gets participation trophies. This is where warriors are made, and watching from the sidelines doesn't make you one of us. Where warriors are made, Sarah repeated slowly as if tasting the words. And you consider yourself warriors? The question carried a subtle challenge that Richardson was too frustrated to miss. We're earning that right every day through training that would break most people. What have you done to earn the right to question us? Sarah looked around the semicircle of young men surrounding her, taking in their faces, their postures, their obvious conviction that they held the moral high ground in this confrontation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, something that made several of the recruits unconsciously step back. What I've done, she said quietly, isn't written on my uniform because some actions carry classifications above your security clearance. Some experiences leave marks that don't show on service records. Some tests don't result in certificates or pins or ribbons. The words were delivered without boast or threat, but they carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Richardson, however, interpreted her response as bureaucratic deflection. Classified, right? Of course. The mysterious intelligence analyst with secret missions that conveniently can't be verified. How convenient that your supposed qualifications are too secret to discuss. Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than her previous calm. You know what, Recruit Richardson? You're absolutely right. Talk is cheap, and claims without proof are worthless. Perhaps a demonstration would be more convincing than words. The statement sent a ripple of anticipation through the gathered recruits. What had begun as intellectual sparring was about to become something more physical, and every person in the room could sense it. The challenge was implicit, but unmistakable, and Richardson found himself in a position where backing down would humiliate him in front of his entire class. What kind of demonstration? He asked, his voice carrying false confidence. Sarah gestured toward the open area near the center of the mess hall, where tables had been moved aside to accommodate serving lines. Simple. If I'm just a desk jockey who doesn't belong here, it should be easy enough to prove. All 15 of you should be able to handle one untested analyst without breaking a sweat. The suggestion sent shocked murmurs through the room. Even Richardson hesitated, recognizing that the situation had escalated far beyond his original intention. Fighting a female superior in the middle of the mess hall could end all of their careers regardless of the outcome. Ma'am, Murphy said carefully, his police background making him acutely aware of how quickly situations could spiral out of control, maybe we should just agree to disagree and move on. But Sarah was already walking toward the open area, her movement forcing the recruits to either follow or appear to back down from their own challenge. The psychological dynamics of group confrontation made retreat nearly impossible once the stakes had been raised this high. I understand your hesitation, Sarah called over her shoulder as she reached the center of the room. After all, you've invested months in training. It would be embarrassing to lose that because you couldn't handle a simple demonstration against someone who supposedly doesn't belong here. The taunt was expertly delivered, playing on the very pride and identity that had driven the confrontation in the first place. Richardson found himself walking forward before his rational mind could stop him, his teammates following out of loyalty and mob psychology. As the 15 recruits spread out around her in the open space, Sarah removed her uniform jacket and placed it carefully on a nearby chair. Underneath, her simple green t-shirt revealed the lean muscle definition of someone who maintained peak physical condition, but nothing that immediately suggested exceptional combat capability. The mess hall had cleared of other personnel who recognized that what was about to happen would be either spectacular or catastrophic. But either way, it would be career-ending for everyone involved if authorities arrived at the wrong moment. Richardson looked around at his teammates, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. This had begun as a way to put an arrogant outsider in her place. but something about Sarah's confidence suggested they might be walking into something they didn't understand. "Last chance to reconsider," Sarah said quietly, beginning to stretch her shoulders and neck in preparation. "Once we start, we finish. No stopping because someone gets hurt. No claiming afterwards that it wasn't fair. You want to test whether I belong here? This is your test." The silence in the mess hall was absolute, except for the humming of fluorescent lights overhead. 15 SEAL recruits stood in a loose circle around Sarah Martinez, each man acutely aware that they had crossed a line from which there was no graceful retreat. The open space between the tables felt like an arena, and every person remaining in the room understood they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after training was completed. Richardson looked at his teammates, searching their faces for the confidence he no longer felt. Wilson stood to his left, his firefighter background evident in his solid stance, but uncertainty clouding his expression. Chen had positioned himself slightly behind and to the right, his Army Ranger training automatically placing him where he could observe multiple angles. Murphy, the former detective, kept glancing toward the exits, his law enforcement instincts warning him that this situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control. "Ma'am," Murphy tried one final time, "we don't need to do this. We can chalk this up to a misunderstanding and move on." Sarah finished her stretching routine and looked around the circle of young men surrounding her. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, as if she were preparing for a routine workout rather than facing 15 trained warriors simultaneously. "The time for backing down passed when you decided to corner me and question my right to exist in your world," she replied quietly. "You wanted to test me. You wanted proof. Actions speak louder than credentials. Remember?" Her words carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had made a decision and would not be dissuaded. Richardson realized with growing dread that his attempt to intimidate her had instead triggered something he didn't understand. "How do you want to do this?" asked Jackson Hayes, a quiet recruit from Montana who rarely spoke, but possessed the lean strength of someone raised on a ranch. His question carried the practical concern of someone who recognized that 15-on-1 was inherently chaotic and dangerous, regardless of skill levels involved. Sarah considered the question for a moment, her eyes moving methodically around the circle as if she were calculating angles and distances. "Simple rules. You try to restrain me or force me to submit. I try to remain free and mobile. We continue until either all of you are unable to continue or I am unable to continue. No weapons, no permanent damage if it can be avoided." The casual way she discussed the possibility of disabling 15 men drew nervous laughs from several recruits. Richardson forced a confident smile, telling himself that her calm demeanor was just an act designed to psych them out. "You realize there are 15 of us, right?" he asked, gesturing around the circle. "I can count," Sarah replied simply. Wilson stepped forward first, his firefighter training having taught him to face dangerous situations directly rather than hesitate. His approach was cautious but determined, hands raised in a defensive posture as he tried to gauge her reaction. Sarah waited until he was within arm's reach, then moved with a speed that caught everyone by surprise. Her right hand shot forward, striking Wilson's wrist and deflecting his grab attempt while her left foot swept his legs. He went down hard, the back of his head striking the floor with a sound that made everyone wince. Before Wilson had even hit the ground, Sarah was already moving toward Chen, who had started advancing from her right side. The former Ranger tried to use his reach advantage, launching a quick jab that should have connected with her shoulder. Instead, she flowed around the attack like water, her left hand redirecting his arm, while her right elbow drove into his solar plexus with surgical precision. Chen doubled over, gasping for air, as Sarah continued her motion toward Richardson. The big Texan had been moving to grab her from behind, confident that his size and strength would end the confrontation quickly. What he found instead was empty air where she had been standing and a sharp pain in his knee as her heel struck the side of his leg. The psychological impact of seeing 3 teammates disabled in less than 10 seconds was devastating for the remaining recruits. What they had expected to be a brief lesson in humility for an overconfident analyst had become something entirely different. The woman moving between them with fluid grace was not the desk jockey they had cornered in the corner. Murphy tried to tackle her low, using his detective training to go for her legs rather than attempting to strike her upper body. Sarah leaped over his diving form, using his back as a springboard to launch herself toward Hayes and Andrews, who were rushing her from opposite sides. She landed between them as they converged, then dropped into a crouch that caused their grabbing attempts to overshoot her position. Her hands shot upward simultaneously, striking both men in the throat with controlled precision that left them choking, but not seriously injured. The remaining recruits hesitated, finally beginning to understand that they were not facing someone who had learned to fight in a gym or even in conventional military training. The way Sarah moved, the efficiency of her strikes, the complete absence of wasted motion, it all spoke to a level of combat experience that exceeded anything in their backgrounds. Rodriguez, a former Marine who had served in Afghanistan, was the first to recognize what they were actually facing. "Jesus," he whispered to Thompson, standing next to him. "She's not military intelligence. Look at how she moves." Thompson, whose father had been a Navy SEAL, suddenly understood Rodriguez's concern. The techniques Sarah was demonstrating weren't standard military combatives. They were too refined, too specialized, too deadly in their efficiency. "We need to stop this," Thompson said. But even as the words left his mouth, Sarah was engaging the next group of recruits. Peterson and Miller rushed her together, trying to use coordinated teamwork to overwhelm her positioning. Sarah waited until they were committed to their approach, then stepped sideways at the last moment, causing Peterson to collide with Miller while she continued past them toward the remaining group. Her elbow caught Peterson in the ribs as she passed, while her foot hooked Miller's ankle, sending both men tumbling to the floor in a tangled heap. The sound of bodies hitting the deck echoed through the mess hall like drum beats, marking the rhythm of the one-sided battle. Richardson struggled to his feet, his knee throbbing from her earlier strike, and realized with growing horror that half his team was already down or disabled. The woman they had cornered was systematically dismantling 15 trained warriors with a level of skill that suggested she could have ended the fight much more decisively if she had chosen to do so. "What the hell are you?" he gasped, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Sarah paused in her movement, standing in the center of the room surrounded by groaning recruits. Her breathing was slightly elevated, but nowhere near the level of exertion that should have accompanied fighting multiple opponents. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her stance remained balanced and ready. "I'm someone who earned her place here through methods your security clearance doesn't cover," she replied, her voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "I'm someone who was tested in ways that don't appear on any training schedule. I'm someone who proved herself worthy in situations you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares." Thompson stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender rather than attack. "Ma'am, we made a mistake. We misjudged you. This doesn't need to continue." But Rodriguez wasn't ready to quit. His Marine pride demanded that he at least attempt to salvage something from the disaster. He feinted left, then drove right, trying to use his superior size and weight to bear her to the ground through pure force. Sarah sidestepped his charge and used his momentum against him, redirecting his energy into the wall where he struck with enough force to leave a dent in the drywall. He slumped to the floor, conscious but clearly done fighting. The remaining recruits, Thompson, Davis, Baker, Martinez, and Johnson, looked at each other with the dawning realization that they were not equipped for this fight. Whatever training they had received, whatever experience they had gained, it was inadequate for dealing with the woman who stood before them. Davis, a former Army helicopter mechanic who had transferred to the SEAL program, tried a different approach. Instead of charging directly at her, he attempted to circle around behind her while Thompson created a distraction from the front. Sarah tracked both movements without turning her head, demonstrating the kind of spatial awareness that came from operating in environments where threats could materialize from any direction at any time. When Davis made his move, she was already pivoting, her hands moving in a complex pattern that resulted in Davis flying through the air to land heavily on one of the mess hall tables. Thompson's distraction became his downfall as Sarah's attention returned to him with laser focus. Her leg swept his feet while her hand struck his shoulder, dropping him to the floor with clinical efficiency. Baker and Martinez attacked together, finally showing some of the teamwork that had been drilled into them during their training. They moved in coordinated patterns, trying to force Sarah into a position where she couldn't avoid both of them simultaneously. For a moment, it seemed their strategy might work. Sarah found herself with limited maneuvering room, both men approaching from angles that should have trapped her between them. But instead of trying to escape the trap, she moved directly toward it. She dove between them at the last second, rolling across the floor and coming up behind their position while they were still trying to adjust to her unexpected movement. 2 quick strikes to pressure points in their necks sent both men to their knees, temporarily paralyzed as their nervous systems tried to process the precise disruption of their motor functions. Johnson was the last man standing, and he showed no inclination to continue the fight. The former college wrestler had enough experience with physical confrontation to recognize when he was completely outclassed. He raised his hands and stepped back, shaking his head. "I'm done," he announced clearly. "I don't know who you are, ma'am, but you've proved your point." Sarah straightened up, surveying the aftermath of the brief but decisive engagement. 15 SEAL recruits lay scattered around the mess hall in various states of discomfort and humiliation. Some were slowly getting to their feet. Others remained on the ground nursing injuries that would heal, but would remind them of this encounter for weeks to come. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes from the first strike to Johnson's surrender. What the recruits had expected to be a quick lesson in hierarchy had become a demonstration of their own limitations and assumptions. Richardson struggled to a sitting position, his face showing the confusion and embarrassment of someone whose world view had just been shattered. "How?" he asked simply. Sarah picked up her uniform jacket from the chair where she had placed it and began putting it back on. Her movements were calm and methodical, showing no signs of the adrenaline that should have been coursing through her system after such an intense physical encounter. "The same way you earned your place here," she replied, "through training, testing, and proving myself capable of doing what others cannot. The difference is that my training began before yours and took place in environments where failure meant death, rather than just starting over." Chen had managed to catch his breath and was leaning against a table, holding his ribs where her elbow had struck. "What unit?" he asked, his Army background helping him recognize that he had encountered someone with special operations training that exceeded his own. Sarah finished adjusting her uniform and looked around the room at the 15 young men who had learned a hard lesson about making assumptions. Her expression was not unkind, but it carried the authority of someone who had just definitively established her place in their hierarchy. "That information is classified," she replied. "But since you asked the right question, I'll tell you this much. I've been in places where the enemy doesn't follow the Geneva Convention, where backup is days away, where the mission's success depends entirely on your ability to neutralize threats quickly and quietly. I've operated in environments where these techniques weren't training exercises. They were the difference between completing the mission and never coming home." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These recruits had been pushing themselves through the most demanding training the military offered, convinced that they were preparing to join an elite brotherhood. Now they realized that the brotherhood might be larger and more secretive than they had imagined. Murphy pulled himself to his feet, his detective instincts finally putting pieces together that should have been obvious from the beginning. "You're not here to observe our training," he said slowly. "You're here to evaluate us." Sarah's slight smile confirmed his deduction. "Very good, Detective Murphy." "Yes. I'm here to evaluate your class for possible selection into programs that don't appear on any organizational chart. Programs that require capabilities beyond what standard SEAL training provides." The revelation sent shocked murmurs through the group of battered recruits. They had been so focused on proving they belonged in the SEAL community that they hadn't considered the possibility that the SEAL community itself was just another stepping stone to something even more exclusive. Wilson sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his head where it had struck the floor. "And we just failed the test, didn't we?" "Actually," Sarah replied, "you just completed the most important part of it. I needed to see how you would react when your assumptions were challenged, how you would handle encountering someone whose capabilities exceeded your own, and whether you could recognize when you were outclassed." She gestured around the room at the scattered recruits. "Some of you showed good tactical thinking. Others demonstrated loyalty to teammates even when the situation was hopeless. A few of you were smart enough to recognize when to stop fighting. These are all valuable traits in the kind of operations I'm screening for." Richardson finally managed to stand, leaning heavily against a table for support. "So, this was all a setup?" "Not exactly," Sarah replied. "I had planned to conduct my evaluation through observation and interviews. You forced a more direct assessment when you decided to corner me and demand proof of my qualifications. I simply adapted to the situation you created." The recruits looked at each other with new understanding. What they had interpreted as an arrogant desk jockey refusing to be intimidated had actually been a special operations veteran, allowing them to dig themselves deeper into a situation they couldn't handle. "The question now," Sarah continued, "is what you do with this experience. Do you let pride and embarrassment cloud your judgment? Or do you learn from encountering capabilities that exceed your current level and use that knowledge to improve yourselves?" Thompson, who had been quietly observing the exchange, raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, what would we need to do to qualify for the kind of program you're talking about?" Sarah's expression shifted, showing the first hint of approval she had displayed since the confrontation began. "That's the right question, Recruit Thompson. The fact that you're asking about qualification requirements rather than making excuses for your performance suggests you might have potential for advanced selection." She looked around the room at all 15 recruits, taking in their battered appearance and chastened expressions. "The first requirement is the ability to recognize when you don't know something and seek to learn rather than assuming you already understand. The second is the capacity to accept that there are always people better than you and use that knowledge to improve rather than letting it destroy your confidence." Hayes, the quiet recruit from Montana, spoke up from where he sat holding his throat. "What about the other requirements?" "The other requirements," Sarah replied, "begin with successfully completing your current training and earning your trident. Everything else builds from that foundation. But I will say this. The fact that you're all still here, still asking questions rather than making excuses, suggests that several of you might warrant further evaluation." The mess hall had begun filling with other personnel who had heard about the confrontation and come to investigate. Senior instructors, administrative staff, and curious trainees gathered at the edges of the room, taking in the scene of 15 battered SEAL candidates and one unmarked woman who showed no signs of having been in a fight. Master Chief Peterson, the senior enlisted instructor for Class 247, pushed through the crowd with an expression that promised severe consequences for everyone involved. His eyes took in the damaged furniture, the scattered recruits, and the woman standing calmly in the center of it all. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years dealing with military personnel who made poor decisions. Before any of the recruits could respond, Sarah stepped forward and handed Peterson a folder that she had somehow acquired, despite having been in the middle of a fight moments earlier. "Master Chief, I'm Petty Officer Martinez, temporarily assigned under Special Operations Command Directive 77 Alpha. The situation here was a necessary part of my evaluation process. You'll find my authorization and incident report in that folder." Peterson opened the folder and scanned the documents, his expression shifting from anger to confusion to something approaching respect. The papers bore signatures and classifications that carried weight far above the pay grade of anyone in the room. "I see," he said slowly. "And the condition of my recruits?" "Minor injuries consistent with intensive training," Sarah replied professionally. "No permanent damage, no medical intervention required. They demonstrated admirable dedication to their teammates and showed the kind of fighting spirit you want in SEAL candidates." Her diplomatic phrasing provided face-saving cover for the recruits, while making it clear that the confrontation had been one-sided. Peterson, who had enough experience to read between the lines, nodded slowly. "I trust your evaluation is complete?" "For now," Sarah confirmed. "I'll be submitting my preliminary report tomorrow. Several of these candidates warrant continued observation for potential advanced selection." The formal exchange between Sarah and Master Chief Peterson drove home to the recruits just how far out of their depth they had been. This wasn't just about proving they belonged in SEAL training anymore. This was about possibilities they had never imagined and levels of clearance they hadn't known existed. The medical bay at the Naval Special Warfare Facility buzzed with quiet activity as Corpsman Jackson examined the last of the 15 recruits from Class 247. Despite Sarah's assurance that no serious injuries had occurred, Master Chief Peterson had ordered mandatory medical evaluations for everyone involved in what was already being whispered about as the mess hall incident. Richardson sat on an examination table, an ice pack pressed against his swollen knee, watching as his teammates received similar treatment for their various aches and pains. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mental adjustment they were all struggling with. In the space of 3 minutes, everything they thought they understood about their place in the military hierarchy had been completely overturned. Bruised ribs, minor contusion on the back of the head, slight muscle strain in the shoulder, Corpsman Jackson announced as he finished examining Wilson. "You'll be sore for a few days, but nothing that should interfere with training. Consider yourself lucky. Based on what I'm hearing about what happened, it could have been much worse." The medical evaluation process gave the recruits time to process what they had experienced, but it also allowed word of the incident to spread throughout the facility. By evening, everyone from kitchen staff to senior officers had heard some version of the story about the intelligence analyst who had single-handedly defeated an entire class of SEAL candidates. Master Chief Peterson appeared in the medical bay doorway just as the last examinations were being completed. His expression was unreadable, which made the recruits more nervous than if he had been visibly angry. They had seen him deal with training infractions before, and his calm demeanor usually preceded severe disciplinary action. "All of you, Conference Room 3, 0800 tomorrow morning," he announced. "Full dress uniforms. There will be some people who want to speak with you about today's events." The ominous nature of his announcement sent worried glances between the recruits. Richardson found his voice first, the leadership role he had claimed during the confrontation, making him feel responsible for the consequences facing his teammates. "Master Chief, whatever happens, this was my fault. I started the confrontation. The others were just backing me up like teammates should." Peterson's expression softened slightly at the display of accountability, but his voice remained stern. "Richardson, what happened today goes way beyond normal training incidents. The people who want to speak with you tomorrow aren't interested in assigning blame. They're interested in understanding what they observed and what it means for your future." After Peterson left, the recruits gathered in their barracks, finally able to speak freely about what they had experienced. The initial shock was beginning to give way to a mixture of embarrassment, curiosity, and grudging respect for the woman who had so thoroughly outclassed them. "I've been thinking about what she said," Chen observed, sitting on his bunk and gingerly touching his ribs. "About programs that don't appear on organizational charts. My ranger training never covered anything like what she demonstrated today." Murphy nodded agreement. 20 years of police work, including tactical team operations, and I've never seen anything like that level of skill. The way she moved, the precision of her strikes, the complete situational awareness. That's not standard military training. Thompson, who had been quiet since returning from medical, finally spoke up. "My father was a SEAL for 12 years. He told me stories about operators who worked missions that were never officially acknowledged, people who functioned at levels beyond what most special operations personnel ever reach. I always thought he was exaggerating." "What kind of missions?" asked Hayes, his usual reserve overcome by curiosity. "The kind where there are no backup plans because backup would create international incidents," Thompson replied quietly. "The kind where success means nobody ever knows you were there, and failure means starting a war." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on their barracks door. Wilson opened it to find Sarah Martinez standing in the hallway, now wearing civilian clothes that somehow made her appear both more approachable and more dangerous. Gone was the unremarkable analyst they had initially dismissed. In her place stood someone whose confidence and bearing marked her as belonging to an elite level of military service. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, stepping into the room. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow's meeting." The recruits scrambled to their feet, uncertain of proper protocol for addressing someone whose rank and authority remained unclear. Sarah gestured for them to remain at ease and found a chair near the center of the room. "First, I owe you an apology," she began, her tone more informal than it had been during their confrontation. "I could have diffused the situation in the mess hall without resorting to physical demonstration. I chose not to because I wanted to observe how you would handle encountering someone whose capabilities exceeded your expectations." Richardson shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, you don't owe us any apology. We were out of line, and we got what we deserved." "Perhaps," Sarah replied. "But you were also acting on assumptions that weren't entirely unreasonable given the information you had. Young warriors testing boundaries and asserting their identity is normal behavior. What happened today taught me as much about your character as it taught you about mine." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each recruit. "I want you to understand what tomorrow's meeting is actually about. It's not a disciplinary hearing. It's not an investigation into misconduct. It's a recruitment briefing for a program that most military personnel never know exists." The statement sent electricity through the room. After months of grueling training to earn their place in the SEAL community, the possibility of selection for an even more exclusive program was both thrilling and terrifying. "What kind of program?" asked Martinez, the quiet recruit who shared Sarah's surname but no relation. "The kind that requires people who can adapt to impossible situations, who can function effectively when all their assumptions prove wrong, and who can maintain their composure when facing opponents who completely outclass them," Sarah replied. "Today's incident wasn't a failure on your part. It was a perfect demonstration of exactly the qualities we look for." Davis, who had been launched across a table during the fight, raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, with respect, we got our asses handed to us. How is that a demonstration of desirable qualities?" Sarah smiled, the first completely genuine expression of warmth they had seen from her. "Because you kept fighting even when it was obvious you were outmatched. Because you supported your teammates even when the situation was hopeless. Because you showed enough intelligence to recognize when to stop fighting and enough character to ask good questions afterward." She leaned forward in her chair, her expression becoming more serious. The program I represent deals with threats that conventional military forces can't handle. We operate in environments where backup isn't available, where rules of engagement are determined by mission success rather than policy manuals, and where failure has consequences that extend far beyond personal career implications. Like what? Asked Johnson, the wrestler who had been smart enough to surrender when he was the last man standing. Like preventing terrorist cells from acquiring weapons of mass destruction in countries where we officially have no military presence, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Like eliminating threats to American interests in regions where conventional military action would trigger international crises. Like gathering intelligence from sources that require infiltration capabilities beyond what standard special operations training provides. The room fell silent as the recruits absorbed the implications of what she was describing. These weren't just advanced military operations. These were the kinds of missions that existed in the shadows between official policy and practical necessity. The selection process for this program doesn't involve written tests or standardized evaluations, Sarah continued. It involves observing how candidates respond to unexpected challenges, how they adapt when their training proves inadequate, and how they handle discovering that their understanding of their own capabilities and limitations was incomplete. Peterson spoke up from the corner where he had been sitting quietly. That's why today happened the way it did. You were being tested without knowing you were being tested. Your reactions were completely genuine because you had no idea what was actually occurring. And we passed? Richardson asked, hardly daring to hope. Some of you showed exceptional potential, Sarah replied carefully. Others demonstrated qualities that might be developed with proper training. A few of you asked exactly the right questions at exactly the right moments. She stood up and walked to the window, overlooking the training facilities where they had spent months pushing themselves to their limits. Tomorrow's meeting will involve people whose names you won't be allowed to repeat and whose organizations don't officially exist. They'll explain opportunities that go far beyond anything you imagined when you volunteered for SEAL training. What's the catch? Asked Chen, his analytical mind refusing to believe that getting thoroughly defeated in hand-to-hand combat could somehow lead to advanced opportunities. The catch, Sarah replied, is that success in this program requires completely redefining your understanding of what service to your country might involve. It means accepting that your family and friends will never know what you actually do for a living. It means operating with levels of autonomy and responsibility that can be terrifying. It means facing enemies who don't follow any rules you've learned to expect. She turned back to face the group of young men who were suddenly confronting possibilities they had never considered. It also means joining a community of operators who function at levels of capability that most people consider impossible. It means access to training, resources, and mission assignments that represent the absolute pinnacle of what special operations forces can achieve. Wilson, who had been the first to go down in their fight, raised his hand. Ma'am, what made you think we might be candidates for this kind of program? Your psychological profile suggested high adaptive capacity and strong team loyalty, Sarah replied. Your training performance indicated above-average physical and mental resilience. But the real indicators came from watching how you handled unexpected stress and how you responded to having your worldview challenged. She gestured toward Richardson. Your willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of your decisions, even when those consequences might affect your entire team. That's leadership quality we can't teach. Moving to Chen, she continued. Your ability to maintain tactical thinking even when physically overwhelmed. You were analyzing my techniques even while they were being used against you. Each recruit received similar analysis, as Sarah demonstrated that she had been evaluating far more than their fighting skills during the brief confrontation. She had been assessing character traits, mental flexibility, and psychological resilience that would determine their suitability for operations beyond conventional military scope. The people you'll meet tomorrow represent selection boards for programs that don't recruit through normal channels, Sarah explained. They identify candidates through observation of performance in extreme situations. Today's incident provided perfect conditions for that kind of evaluation. Murphy, drawing on his law enforcement background, asked the question that was troubling several of them. Ma'am, if these programs operate outside official channels, how do we know they're legitimate? How do we know we're not being recruited for something illegal? Sarah nodded approvingly at the question. Smart concern, Detective Murphy. That's exactly the kind of critical thinking that these programs require. Tomorrow's briefing will include full legal authorization and congressional oversight documentation. Everything these programs do is legal under classifications that aren't available to general military personnel. She checked her watch and moved toward the door. Get good rest tonight. Tomorrow will involve psychological evaluations, security clearance interviews, and capability assessments that will make SEAL training feel like basic fitness requirements. If you're selected, your real education will begin immediately. As she reached the door, Rodriguez called out, Ma'am, one more question. In the mess hall, you said you'd been tested in ways we couldn't imagine. What did you mean? Sarah paused, her hand on the doorknob, and for a moment, her professional composure slipped enough to reveal something harder underneath. I meant that I've been in situations where the only thing standing between American civilians and mass casualties was my ability to neutralize threats quickly and quietly. I've operated alone in hostile territory for weeks at a time, gathering intelligence that prevented attacks you'll never read about in newspapers. I've eliminated high-value targets in ways that allowed their own organizations to believe their deaths were accidents. The room fell completely silent as the weight of her words settled over them. This wasn't someone playing soldier or demonstrating techniques learned in training exercises. This was someone who had killed people in service to their country, who had operated in the shadows between peace and war, who had carried burdens that would never be officially acknowledged. That's what these programs require, she continued quietly. The willingness to accept responsibility for actions that protect innocent people but can never be publicly recognized. The ability to live with secrets that you'll carry for the rest of your lives. The strength to do what's necessary even when it costs pieces of your soul. She opened the door, then looked back one final time. If that level of service appeals to you, tomorrow's meeting will change your lives forever. If it doesn't, completing SEAL training will still make you valuable assets to conventional special operations forces. Either choice represents honorable service to your country. After she left, the recruits sat in stunned silence, each lost in his own thoughts about possibilities they had never considered and responsibilities they weren't sure they were ready to accept. The woman they had dismissed as a desk jockey had revealed herself to be something far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined possible. Holy shit, Wilson finally whispered. What the hell did we stumble into? Thompson stared at the closed door where Sarah had disappeared. I think we stumbled into something my father always said existed but could never talk about. The people who do the jobs that keep the rest of us sleeping peacefully at night. Are we really ready for that? Asked Hayes, voicing the question that was troubling all of them. Richardson looked around the room at his teammates, these men who had supported him even when his pride had led them into an impossible situation. I don't know if any of us are ready, but I know that 6 months ago, we weren't ready for SEAL training either. We became ready by doing it. This is different, Murphy pointed out. This is about crossing lines that you can never uncross. About becoming someone you might not recognize in the mirror. Maybe, Chen agreed. But it's also about protecting people who will never know they needed protecting. About serving at a level that most people can't imagine. About being part of something that matters in ways we're just beginning to understand. The conversation continued late into the night, as 15 young men wrestled with decisions that would define not just their careers, but their entire identities. They had entered the day as SEAL candidates focused on earning their place in an elite military community. They would enter tomorrow's meeting as potential recruits for something that existed beyond elite, something that operated in the spaces between official policy and practical necessity. Outside their barracks, Sarah Martinez stood in the shadows listening to fragments of their conversation. Her evaluation of their potential had been accurate, but their final selection would depend on how they handled tomorrow's revelations about the true nature of the programs she represented. In 12 hours, some of these young men would begin a journey that would transform them into operators capable of missions that existed only in classified files and unmarked graves. Others would complete their SEAL training and serve with distinction in conventional special operations roles. All of them would carry the memory of the day they learned that their understanding of service to country had been merely the beginning of a much longer story. The mess hall incident would be remembered in training folklore as the Day 15 SEAL candidates discovered that the woman they had cornered was actually a guardian angel who protected American interests in ways that could never be officially acknowledged. But for the participants themselves, it would always be remembered as the moment they learned that their country needed protectors who were willing to become something more than soldiers, something that operated in the darkness between heroism and necessity. As Sarah disappeared into the night to file her report on the day's events, she carried with her the knowledge that several of these recruits possessed the rare combination of skills, character, and psychological resilience required for the most dangerous and important missions their country would never admit existed. Tomorrow would begin the process of transforming potential into capability, of molding young warriors into something that could function effectively in the shadows where freedom was protected by people whose names would never appear in history books. The fluorescent lights in the barracks finally went out as 15 young men tried to sleep while contemplating futures they had never imagined possible. In the morning, some of them would step through a door that could never be reopened, beginning journeys that would take them far beyond the boundaries of conventional military service into realms where the only measure of success was the safety of people who would never know their names. The mess hall incident had ended, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold in ways that would echo through classified operations around the world for years to come.